Good morning. Thank you, Professor Dugin. It's a pleasure and privilege to be attending the meeting of conservative intellectuals in Chisinau. What a pleasure to be in Moldova with our dear friend Yuri Roshka and all of you. We look like a group of utopian conspirators, and I will try to be in the trend of this mood, and I will join and speak about my utopian ideas. I have decided to call my short address this morning with the following title: The Challenges of Modern Traditionalism. We have devoted close to 25 years after the collapse of communism and hegemony and establishment of monopoly of liberalism to our quest and to our struggle against totalitarian liberalism. Some of us came into this fight earlier, immediately after the collapse of Marxism or communist system. Some of us, perhaps due to our age and our personal evolution, have joined this struggle later, but nonetheless we can state with certain degree of accuracy that by the middle of 2010s, in the 21st century, very little people of age above 35 or 40 with a proper degree of conscience and decency can remain in liberalism. René Guénon wrote 100 years ago that there are only two types of people who can believe in narrative of Western civilization: naive fools or cynics. And I think this narrative is exhausted by now completely. So if you are with liberalism today, you are either a complete cynic or a complete fool. Having arrived at this time, at this stage, what do we see? We see that liberalism was a beautiful and enchanting dissident to communism, and we were all, to different degrees, hijacked by its beauty. But when left alone, it started eating itself, and it started contradicting itself, and it became a much uglier and much more ruthless and brutal form of totalitarianism than we have seen, I'm afraid, in fascism or in communism. So we all, from different countries, the traditionalists, the representatives of intellectual, religious tradition, one by one have begun resisting it. Liberalism came into our countries via different forms of influence. In some countries, I would say the more west you go, the more ruthless the occupation of liberalism. I would say in some countries its influence and its hegemony and its despotism is mainly manifested through economic measures. In other countries through political measures, but universally across the globe, I would say that liberalism kills more people and makes unhappy more people than any other form of totalitarianism that we have seen up until now. So we, the fragmented representatives of tradition, have started coming together through friendships and forums like this and thinking what to do. We are finishing the first quarter of a century of deconstructing liberalism, of opposing liberalism, of criticizing liberalism. And I'm here to share my opinion with you that I think this is enough. This is not to say that we need to stop criticizing this form of totalitarianism, but I think enough has been said about what we do not want, what is unacceptable for us in the modern totalitarian liberal system. The main challenge of traditional discussion as I see it ahead of us, is to move from being dissidents to being the creators. Because if we do not do this, we run the risk that has killed liberalism. Liberalism was a beautiful dissident to communism, like I said, but with the collapse of communism, it has completely lost its function. If we do not want to share that fate of dying together with liberalism, we, the representatives of tradition, are faced with an extremely difficult, but yet a very, how should I say, inspiring challenge of reinventing ourselves from negative into the affirmative narrative of tradition. I came here today to share with you some of my humble views. You will find them very raw, very initial, very unprepared, on what should be the components or the vectors of that narrative, what should be the constituency or the backbone of our positive narrative, our affirmative narrative of tradition in the post-liberal era. I don't want to sound naive and overly optimistic. I do realize that liberalism is just a wounded dragon, which will be dying for the rest of our lives, most likely. It will shed more blood than we have seen shed from communism or fascism, or perhaps both of them combined. And God forbid, many of us may not even live to the point of saying the dragon is dead. St. George has prevailed. But nonetheless, we are already, I think we all share this opinion, we are already in the era of the dying dragon. And therefore, if we want to avoid becoming another dragon ourselves, if we want to avoid becoming authors of the fourth totalitarian form, fourth horse of apocalypse, which will be presented to us anyway by the author of the first three forms of totalitarianism, the liberalism, the Marxism, and the fascism. If we want to avoid being sucked into that deadly stream of alternative creation of another form of despoty, we need to think about how to reconstruct the tradition and how to go back to it. As Professor Dugin rightfully says in many of his lectures and books, the individual subjects or the pancentrums or the centers of three mentioned totalitarianisms were each different. Liberalism centered on Cartesian individual, which is an artificial concept. Marxism centered on class, and Nazism or fascism centered on the race. The deconstruction of these has happened in the reverse chronology, as we know, and communism dragged down and brought down and collapsed the idea of supremacy of the race, and then liberalism brought down and collapsed the idea of supremacy of the class. And the oldest one of the three, who was initially invented, has remained as a standing beauty without any alternatives. And now we are entering the era of destroying liberalism and destroying the supremacy of the individual. I have the honor and pleasure of discussing on numerous occasions with Professor Dugin and with some of you what should be the center of the post-liberal paradigm of the normal society. And we all have different opinions, not necessarily contradictory to each other. For example, Professor Dugin tends to gear towards the idea of people of the empire, if you will, as the carrier, as the center of the alternative matrix. I tend to favor, and again, I don't think we are in contradiction here, I tend to favor more the idea of a family as a center of the alternative constitution. In Budapest yesterday, I said that in my humble opinion, all 193 constitutions on the planet need to be rewritten. And the center of each constitution today is individual, and I'm not an individual. I'm a component, I'm a part. I'm a brother, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son. And when I lose these, I become a pig. I become the enemy of humanity. And so it's not the rights of the individual that we should be protecting in these constitutions. It's the obligation of the individual towards the family that we should be protecting, and the rights of the family that we should be protecting in the Constitution. So the 7 areas, if and when we settle, we meaning the traditionalists or the participants of the traditional discussion, when we settle the argument, or we can not settle the argument, and we can say in one case this may be the people of the empire, in the case of a Caucasian country like Georgia it can be the family. When we then need to move on and discuss 7 areas without handling which we cannot, in my view, move into the affirmative narrative of the tradition. These 7 areas may not be a complete list. Some of them may be cancelled or collapsed into each other, but this is again my preliminary and raw view of the work we need to do if we need to avoid being just dissidents of liberalism. First of all, the civil legal system needs to be completely revamped. I would divide the work to be done by the traditionalists in the civil legal system into 2 hemispheres. One, the disinfection of the existing civil legal systems from the virus of liberalism. Every single constitution, except maybe for North Korean and Cuban and some Islamic states, is completely infested and infected with liberal terminology, paradigms, cliches, and viruses. And they are beyond repair, if you ask me. I'm not an expert on civil law, but from the very little that I know, these are all hopeless cases of perestroika. And therefore, I would favor a complete rewriting, like I said, of the constitutions. And the second part of our work in the civil legal system is the creative part. We need to disinfect and recreate around the chosen pancentrum, the new legal system. The second component that we need to focus on is economics. We live in the liberal economic paradigm. We criticize it. We don't like the Federal Reserve System monopoly and hegemony. We don't like the dogmas of monetarism. We oppose it, but we rarely move beyond the negative criticism. We all tend to be lazy, I think, a little bit about it. And in my view, without offering the humanity the alternative of the structure of how the economic system should be constructing, we will be harmless to liberalism. And therefore, we need to create, and we have some components in the Chinese system. I think Sergei Glaziev in Russia is a very interesting thinker, more so than Professor Katasonov, because he tends to give us more on the positive side. We have some interesting thinkers on the American side in alternative economic system, but the alternative economic model needs to be developed. Third, let me just run through these 7, and then I will move on to the conclusive part. We need to, in those cultures and in those countries where this is possible and desirable by the tradition, we need to rethink and reinvent the model of the monarchy. And what does it mean? Because as we move into the alternative post-liberal paradigm, we need to move into the alternative architecture. And I know that in some countries and in some cultures we will run into skepticism, and some of them will say, what monarchy? What are you talking about? You are just further complicating the discussion. But in some countries, such as mine in Georgia or such as in Russia, it's a very organic concept, and it needs patronage from the traditionalists. It needs attention because if only left to the mercy of monarchs or the descendants of the royal dynasties, you will inevitably end up with a lack of scientific and with a lack of intellectual input. So monarchy needs patronage. Fourth area which needs to be reinvented is the formula between the state and the religion, or the main religious structure of the country. This is taboo in liberalism. Every religious tradition is just an artifact in the museum, which needs to be isolated and visited on Christmas or through some deranged anti-religious movies and songs. Each country needs to go back to rethinking the formula. I think there are some interesting examples. For example, in Georgia we have existing Concordat, which was signed in 1990s, which considers our church and our state equally important subjects, and they have a deal between each other. And it's another thing that everybody ignores, the existing Concordat, but it exists. I think the case of modern state of Israel is worth paying attention to, but other than that, there is very little. Perhaps in the Islamic part of the world, we can find more interesting cases of thought-through structures of cooperation between the state and the religious tradition. But in this case, the most important component in this discussion is to bring up to the front the idea that we have two, not one hands, and we have each country, each tradition needs to treat its religious structure as attentively, as importantly as its civil structure. Without this, we are pseudo-traditionalists. Fifth component, and please excuse this chronology because the chronology is very chaotic and I haven't had time to think through this, is the defense strategy of traditionalism. As I have talked about the dying liberalism and the agony of liberalism, I assure you that no one is going to leave us alone. I'm almost confident that security forces of Moldova are currently very attentively listening to this meeting. And more importantly, I would say, perhaps not only them. And therefore, every meeting, every conversation among the traditional intellectuals is going to be very carefully monitored, and every action, if it dares to approach, as much as approach the real politics or practicality of life, will immediately be attacked. And therefore, traditionalism, if it needs to move from the chambers of dissidentship into the affirmative narrative, needs to have a thought-out, multi-level, sophisticated defense strategy, and we can talk about what it needs to be. The remaining two components, which I would invite all of us to think about, is de-urbanization and demography. De-urbanization is my second religion. I believe we become devils in the city and we become humans in the rural area. I think city is evil and I think village is good. I think city is patriarchal and I think, village is patriarchal and I think city is matriarchal. I think in the city, extra child constrains the family, and I think in the village, extra child helps the family inhabit the space. I think in the city, we are pathetic, and I think in the village, we are happy. And so we are all, as I have called in one of my lectures, unfortunately, homo urbanicus hedonicus to a certain degree, and we need to reinvent ourselves, all of us, outside of the urban Luciferian culture. Now, the methodology of developing these, and demography, of course, is almost a self-evident concept which we need to discuss and respond to. I am the chairman of Georgian Demographic Society. I work on this day and night as much as I can, as much as my business allows. And I think, back to the urbanization aspect, there's very little we can do within the matrix of urbanization to improve our demographics. It is obvious that if we want French to be saved from extinction, if we want Georgians to be saved from extinction, if we want Russians to be saved from extinction, this can only come from the rural traditions of our cultures. okay, we can give some extra tax and money incentives like very thankfully Viktor Orban is doing in Budapest now, but this will have a dismal effect on the true picture. The feeding of our cultures, language, its beauty, literature, demography, everything needs to come from the village, which is dead now. We have uninhabited it. Our cities have turned into magnets, which have sucked in our population and made them alcoholics, junkies, homosexuals, and suicide maniacs. So the cities of our countries in the postmodern paradigm have become like shining lights in the night, which draw butterflies and kill them, our population. So if the 20th century was the century of urbanization, the 21st century, if the humanity wants to save itself, if any culture wants to save itself, needs to become the century of de-urbanization. And therefore, these are the areas that I think we should be focusing on. And there is, I would say, 10, 20, 30 years worth of work for all of us before we can say we have prepared anything. Finally, what will happen if we do not do this? If we do not do this, what we are offered is complete death. I want to stress this very carefully. What we are going towards is an absolute suicide. We are nearing an extinction of our ethnoses and our cultures. Our children, if we grew up in a concept of free life without, for example, depressing levels of personal debt, our children will not even know what it's about. They will grow up since very young age in a paradigm where they will always want more than they have, and as a result, by the time they reach 40 years old, they will be into bank debts up until here, and as a result, they will be depressed, they will be collapsing their families, and they will be alcoholics, and they will be dying. I don't want to scare you, and I don't want to darken the picture, but I think it's obvious where we're going. Now my prognosis. My prognosis is terrible, and I hope I'm wrong. But if I'm not wrong, here is what it is. I think we have a huge war ahead of us coming up. I arrive at the prediction of the war through philosophy, not through analytics, not through geopolitics. For example, if I look at Georgia, my favorite motherland, it's dying from liberalism. The level of gangrena in Tbilisi is almost as bad as in Moscow or as in Paris or anywhere else. The people who are infected with this ideology are completely non-negotiable. You cannot get through to them. There is no argument, there is no behavior, rational behavior, which draws their attention to what is going on. They are zombies. I was one of them when I was young. I know how it works. So, when you look at this gangrena, you see that it's growing. Same picture in Belgrade, by the way, I dealt. It's growing, and I'm not a doctor, but I know that when you have a gangrena on the national organism, you can only treat it with two methods. One is medicaments, antibiotics. So in this case, it means church, it means traditionalist narrative, it means conversation. And the other one is invasive, operational. Put gunpowder on the gangrena and explode it if the medicaments do not treat it. In my unfortunate observation, I do not see the signs of medical treatment helping the liberalism, zombieism of our cities. For example, we have a great, perhaps the greatest patriarch in the world for 40 years speaking to the nation, and nothing helps. These people continue changing color, these people continue becoming infected. So I arrive, so you could say, okay, then the gangrena is not treatable by medicaments, then you die. But I'm a fanatical Georgian, and I know we will not die. I know that Georgia is eternal up until the apocalypse, and I know I risk being naive, but this is who I am. And therefore, because I'm a fanatical Georgian, and because I see that the medical treatment of liberalism is not helping, I arrive at the philosophical prognosis of the war. The war will come and the fire will have to clean out. Again, no one will be happier than me if I'm wrong about this prognosis. I don't know when and where it will start. I worry that it may start this year between Turkey and Greece or Turkey and Russia. This is a historical region of risks for us. But with or without the war, and maybe the war, I don't want to sound like a maniac, but maybe the war is a remedy in our quest. We are faced with these challenges, and I'm very privileged and honored to be a part of this extremely important group. Professor Dugin has rightfully said that it's very symbolic that the President of Moldova decided to meet it because he understands, I suppose, the importance of this conversation. And I assure you that from our side, I will do everything I can to be of help in these discussions and to contribute to the best of my ability to our traditional